11.1, day 3 notes, simplifying square roots with variables. It's the same idea. If we're simplifying the square root of 40, x to the third, y to the fifth, z to the third, we're still going to break things down and break apart that 40 and look for pairs. There is a pair of 2's, so a 2 would go outside, and then the 2 times 5, or a 10, would go inside. But before I write that down, I also want to break up the variables and look for pairs there. X to the third is x times x times x. So there's a pair of x's. That means one x is going to go outside the square root. The other one's going to stay inside. The same sort of thing happens with the y's. The y's are y to the fifth. So I end up with 2 pairs of y's. So I'm going to have y times y on the outside, or y squared, and a lonely y without a pair on the inside. And the same thing with the z's. I have a pair of z's, so one z will go outside, another one will be left inside. So what's outside? Outside we have 2 times x times y times z. 2 times x times y times z. Inside the square root, I have 2 times 5, make it a different, 2 times 5 times x times y times z. So all simplified, y times y is y squared. 2 times 5 is 10, x, y, z. So with the variables, it's the same thing. You're still just looking for pairs. With the variables, you're going to write them all out and then circle the pairs again. Let's do another one like that. The square root of 54, a squared, b squared. So we'll break apart the 54. 54 is 9 times 6. And we do get a pair. A squared and b squared all written out are AA and then BB. So we have a pair of A's and a pair of B's. If we look at the numbers that have pairs, a 3, an A, and a B all go outside. The things that don't have pairs, 3 times 2 is 6. There aren't any variables left inside the square root because all of the variables had pairs. We are also going to divide with square roots. So we're going to divide the square root of t over 6. And this is kind of like yesterday, except for it has a variable in it. Yesterday when we did problems like that, we split it up into the square root of t over the square root of 6. And we said you have to get rid of the square roots on the bottom. This is one where it's nice. You don't have to do that conjugate thing. You just need to multiply by that square root that's in the bottom. In the top, square root of t times square root of 6 is the square root of 6t. And on the bottom, square root of 6 times square root of 6 would be square root of 36. But the square root of 36 is just a 6, and we did get rid of the square root that's in the bottom. Now we would want to check and see if we can break apart and simplify the square root of 6t. But when I look for pairs, there aren't any. The 2 and the 3 aren't a pair, and the t doesn't have any pairs with it either. So this one's done. It's the square root of 6t over 6. Here's another one, the square root of p squared over 8. So we'll split that up into the square root of p squared over the square root of 8. And there are lots of ways to do it, but the easiest way is to simplify first, I think. So if I simplify first, what's the same as the square root of p squared? Just p. The p squared and the square root cancel out. The square root of 8 can be broken down and simplified also. So I'm going to break that apart and look for pairs. And I end up with a pair of 2's and one lonely 2 on the inside. This isn't done, but by simplifying it first, it's going to make the next step easier. The next step is to get rid of the square roots in the bottom. So if I want to get rid of a square root of 2, notice there's no plus or minus in between the two. So I don't have to do that conjugate thing. All I need to do is multiply by the square root of 2. Then going straight across the top, I get p times the square root of 2. Outside things stay outside, inside things stay inside. And the bottom can be a little bit tricky, but I don't think it's so bad. There's a 2 on the outside times the square root of 4. But what is the square root of 4? 2. So the bottom's just 2 times 2, or 4. Now we got rid of all the square roots in the denominator, and that one's totally simplified. Now we'll do some that kind of combine the two things that we've done today. Square root of 3x squared y over y squared. Just like the last one, I want to simplify first. So on the top of the fraction, I have 3x squared y. And on the bottom of the fraction, I have y squared. So if I'm looking for pairs, 3 can't be broken up at all. But I do have a pair of x's, so one of those x's could go out front. And I could have 3y inside the square root. On the bottom, I've got a pair so that y will go outside, and there's nothing left on the inside. So by simplifying first, I already got rid of the square roots in the denominator, and that's what I'm looking to do. So this one's done. They don't all simplify quite that easily. Let's take a look at this next one. The square root of 24x y squared z to the third over 6x squared z. I want to simplify first. That's what we're always going to do with problems like this. It makes it a little bit easier to do. I'll deal with breaking down that 24 in a little bit, but I want to start with the variables. And when I try to simplify the variables, there's a couple different things I can look for. I can look for pairs to try to pull out front. On the top, I have a pair of y's and a pair of z's. And on the bottom, I have a pair of x's. I'm going to deal with the numbers and some of this other stuff in a minute, but for right now, I have a y on the outside since there was a pair, a z on the outside since there was a pair, and an x down here on the outside since there was a pair. Now another thing that's going to simplify and just cancel out is there's a z on the top and on the bottom that you could reduce and just get rid of. So the only thing left as far as variables go is there's going to be a square root of x on the top. With the numbers, you can do the same sort of thing and just reduce it from the beginning. So instead of having a square root of 24 over a square root of 6, you can reduce that fraction and just do 24 divided by 6 and say that's the square root of 4. Since the 24 was on the top, the 4 is going to be on the top. It's kind of like 4 over 1. And the square root of 4 is 2. So I've got a 2 on the top of my fraction. Now there aren't any square roots left on the bottom of the fraction, so this one is simplified. The homework for tonight is the 11.1 Day 3 worksheet. There is a front and a back to that worksheet for you to work on. Have that done when you come to class tomorrow. Friday this week, there's a quiz. The quiz is over the Pythagorean theorem, the distance formula, and all of this square root stuff that we've been doing this week.